Hi, this is Paul. I'm back from Synod. I did that little video about Alex O'Connor, and I had that longer conversation with Bethel and Rod Dreer, but I haven't had a lot of time to make videos, as some of you might have seen. Freddie wasn't in church on Sunday. Mark D. Parker came to visit and even had a gift for Freddie. But there's some stuff going on with Freddie. I'm not going to talk about it on the internet, but it's taken a fair amount of time. There might not be a Freddie and Paul show for a while. So if you're the praying kind, just say a word of prayer for Freddie, because he's going through a tough time, and we'll have to see what all happens with this. Part of the way that Synod works is that there are advisory committees, and those advisory committees take all of the things that come to Synod and portion it out to all these advisory committees, and those are the things that feed it back to the floor of Synod, and things then finally get passed. And the advisory committee that I was on was the Finance and Administration Advisory Committee. So right at the beginning of Synod, for those of you who watch Synod, you'll see that I had stuff right at the beginning of the plenary sessions. And then ours was sort of the last committee of the plenary session. We were given an extra thing to do, but then the big thing that I knew was going to be a really big deal was the question of the banner mandate. Now, what comes out of advisory committees are committee work. And there's about 25 people in a room, and it's closed door, although we have people come in to talk. And what comes out of it is an advisory report that goes to Synod. And if the committee can come to consensus, or at least can come to consensus, then there's one report that goes to Synod. If there are multiple perspectives that aren't that can't be put together, every advisory committee tries to go to Synod with one report. Then there's a majority and a minority, and those who have followed Synod carefully will see that we had several majority and minority Synod reports. While I was at Synod, I clearly recorded a series of conversations with people, friends of mine that are on the Synod floor. I hope to continue to discuss this Synod. The Synod was different from other Synods. The purpose of this video won't be sort of a synodical overview, but to treat what is right now sort of the hot thing going on. And I knew it was going to be a hot thing because the banner for the Christian Reformed Church is a central institution that historically in the church has been its lifeblood. Perhaps one of the best ways to start talking about it and go through the history would be actually to look at some banner articles that have been posted in the past. This one from 1991 has a history of the banner, and I'll put all the links for these articles below. In 1917, the banner's 3,200 subscribers numbered less than half of the 8,600 who subscribed to the Dutch language magazine. The older magazine circulation had already peaked. However, in 1915, 9,000 subscribers. By 1930, the banner had taken the lead. It became the overwhelming dominant Christian Reformed periodical in the 1950s, when the subscribers outnumbered the Dutch version 8-1. In the process, the banner was becoming an increasingly rigid institution. This is from the perspective of 1991. Those of you who are interested in history, there's a thing called historiography. We always look at the past through the lenses of the present. It's unavoidable, it's inevitable. So this is written in 1991. That's important to the conversation that we're going to have. The banner became an increasingly rigid institution. From 1928 until 1957, its columns were parceled out of a small cluster of authors such as E.J. Tanis, H.J. Kuyper, H. Verdine, H. Schultze, J. Geisel, and Uncle Dick. By the 1960s, the banner was largely predictable and nearly papal in its pronouncements. Now, this is important because part of what's going on right now in the Christian Reformed Church is a conversation. And some of that is going on in the banner, as I'll show you some other articles that just came out today. But a lot of that is going on over the other ways that the Christian Reformed Church has conversations. One of those places is CRC Voices, and I'll put you can just Google CRC Voices. It's a listserv. I'll warn those of you who decide, I want to find out what's being talked about, to jump in. It is not accessible like Facebook or Twitter. It is not brief. It is voluminous often, and it is contentious. It is probably as close to a kitchen table as there is left in the CRC right now. Facebook, and because it's not governed by an algorithm the way Facebook is, the way Twitter is. What gets posted to CRC Voices is what goes there. Now, some people read it through a website. That's a little bit more of a filter. I get my CRC Voices straight. But this perspective in 1991 is really key, because that perspective is part of what, again, we've sort of been calling lately the post-war consensus, and we'll talk about that more. So from 1928 to 1957, the banner was nearly papal in its pronouncement. Now, is that what people want from the banner now? Often at Synod, when I was talking to people about this, I would use the word the magisterium, because I think for some people that's sort of what they want from the banner today. But of course, the context for it is very different than it was from 1928 to 1957. In this state, it looked like overripe bunch of bananas. But those who were inclined to satire, And in the 1960s, there was more than enough satirists, particularly among college students, who were touched by the spirit of anti-institutionalism sweeping across Western Europe and North America. Okay, so this is the language of 1991 in the banner of sort of what's going. And today we might call it the counterculture. It was this significant. Now, Tom Holland is writing a book about this period, because Tom Holland believes this period in time and what went through Western Europe is something analogous to what happened in the 16th century with what is popularly called the Protestant Reformation today. This is a massive cultural change that begins in the 60s. In 1970s, a group of Calvin College students hoisted satire's standard over the church, publishing a magazine they dubbed the Banner. They duplicated the banner's design while lampooning each of its regular columns. The spoof outraged a host of readers who considered the parody an attack on venerability of every sort. Others laughed, and laughed again. The Banner was and remains the most successful satire the CRC has ever generated. If you want to read the Banner for yourself, I'll put a link to it below, and you can go ahead and check it out. It will read tame to your eyes today. Let's see. I got to make sure I'm in the right article here. Yeah. We learned, this perspective of 1991. For all of its unpleasant embarrassments, the Banner taught the lesson it intended. Since 1970, the Banner has become more flexible and listed a far greater variety of contributors. The last three editors, Lester DeCoster, Andy Kivenhoven, and Galen Meyer, have opened the editorial windows to admit a wide spectrum of opinions and topics. Now, this is 1991. The iPhone comes in 1997, and that's important. Social media won't really get going in terms of Facebook, Twitter. That environment won't really get going until the teens. Consequently, the recent banter, which earlier this year offered a humorous and technically excellent replay of the Banner, did not generate either the light or the heat of the predecessor. It's news to me. Let me search for it. Nope, couple quick searches. I can't even find it. The object of satire no longer provided the vulnerable topic that inspired the prickly parodies of 1970. From 1903 to the present, the Banner has effectively mirrored the cultural life, to the present, to 91, of the Christian Reformed Church. No student of the denomination's history can ignore the periodical without failing to understand the church. Each of the Banner's editors both influenced and reflected the changes and continuities that shaped the church. I would say in many ways, for much of the CRC history, the Banner editor was the most influential, the most powerful position in the church, at certain points only rivaled by Calvin College philosophy professors, or let's say systematic theologians at the seminary. But I would say even they didn't have the broad influence that Banner editors had, because as was discussed on the floor of Synod, the Banner was in many CRC households in a certain period of time the only publication they would receive, and it came weekly up until a certain point. Henry Beets, the founding editor in 1903 to 1928, was especially concerned about about 1920 to educate the CRC by reviewing its Reformed and Calvinist tradition. Beets attempted to find parallels in the United States of persons and events from Calvin's history. Persons such as Votius, W.A. Brackle, Abraham Kuyper, as well as events like the Synod of Dort and the doctrinal renewal of the 1834 succession. In doing so, Beets hoped to create a Dutch-American cultural fusion. Thus, he found parallels between New England Puritans and Dutch settlers of Iowa and Michigan, while George Washington, he saw similarity with William of Orange. With such analogies, Beets offered a strategy for legitimate Americanization. In the 1920s, when the CRC became embroiled in controversy, those worldly amusements, that a very famous report came out about card playing, movie going, these kinds of things that came out in the 1920s, after the First World War, obviously, Beets sought to turn the denomination's attention towards foreign missions and more positive endeavor. He hoped would direct the community away from fratricidal rage in order to keep the community together. Unlike Beets, editor Henry J. Kuyper was not an immigrant. Kuyper wrote as a more confident cultural insider, steering a course between fundamentalists and modernists. His efforts fostered a growth of independent cultural judgments and the expansion of separate Christian institutions like schools, hospitals, labor unions, and homes for the ages. Now, again, what's interesting is that reading this, you might see that Kuyper was an innovator and an Americanizer. He, of course, brought hymns into the Christian Reformed Church. He promoted Christian schools. He promoted English language worship services. He was born in the United States, but if you read his stuff, it very much looks like this is preservation. This is conservatism. This is the Benedict option, putting up walls before Rod Dreher was ever born. Throughout the 1930s and the World War II, Kuyper condemned both communism and fascism. He perceptively noted that a fascist threat to the United States endangered Christianity and democracy on the home front. You might compare Kuyper to Pius XI and Pius XII. And he opposed the use of the atomic weapons. By 1950s, however, both Kuyper and the denomination gave full support to the anti-communist ethos that peaked during the McCarthy hearings in 1957. The prominence of anti-communism and the generally conservative mood that dominated the 50s and early 60s continued to shape the Banner's perspective during John Vander Ploeg's editorship. But that era also incorporated the CRC's centennial, which provided natural occasion to re-explore the church's origins and traditions. In a sense, when Vander Ploeg's tenure rounded out the century of the CRC's history by repeating perspectives and themes from the first decades of the Beets era. From the 70s to the present, the Banner has focused on issues that have risen from wider culture rather than from internal doctrinal and ecclesiastical matters: racism, pacifism, nationalism, and feminism. Now, you might ask, well, what would be parallels to the Banner? Many denominations in the print era before the internet had publishing houses. That was a core function of a denomination. Again, if you've listened to some of my other videos, I don't think we've really thought seriously about how denominations have been disrupted. But these were core. And part of what happened, well, since this period, since the 90s and aughts, most denominations, the Banner went from a weekly magazine to a monthly magazine. We'll talk a little bit about more the history that happens after 91. In December 1980, Andrew Kuyvenhoven's blazing wooden shoes on the banner's cover, which I've talked about quite a bit, refocused the CRC's attention on its changing identity. The image raised, as well as the complex imperative to embrace the whole community of CRC people without denigrating the particular story of God's ways with a denomination that has Netherlandic character and roots. So you see here, already they're grappling with it. They're grappling with the 70s. And I would, well, maybe I'll read what I wrote on Voices today. To banner or not to banner. The banner shifted with Kuyvenhoven, and this shift has now referred to as the post-war consensus. The name is imperfect, but the dynamics are quite evident. Everyone felt the cultural shift, the last major vibe shift before this one, perhaps. Look at the pushback the banana received. Pretty tame stuff by internet meme standards. Anyone who's been on the internet and gone to adulthood has seen far worse than the banana ever dared to deal out. No President Spoolhoff working hard to confiscate all the paper issues to shield young CRC impressionable souls. Calls to expel the students, calls for church discipline. Any of us old enough to remember or remember our parents' stories understand the climate of the CRC in those days, and Brink talked about that. Those who created the banana, partly because of the pushback, became cultural heroes within the CRC. What was forbidden in 1970 was celebrated 40 years later. And I'll put a link below. There's a video below of the two editors of the banner of the Chimes that year. The Chimes is the student newspaper of then Calvin College, who wrote the banner, and they have a retrospective where they're on stage. They're celebrated. The banner was seen as, in many ways, this was the coming of this new generation. And those who, as is commonly the case when you had you had your student newspaper at Calvin, in some ways your brightest and your best would be the editors, they would be the writers. To be a student, to be on the student newspaper in the 50s and 60s and 70s, this was to be, and to a certain degree in the 80s, although that was diminishing already. I started Calvin in 81. These were the leaders, and the Chime spoof was, as Herb Brink said, the most successful spoof in CRC history. The banana, partly because of the pushback, became cultural heroes within the CRC. They were the new young leadership who would blaze the trail for the application of that vibe shift for a generation. But it's a different world. Many interpret what happened at Senate as we're going back to those days. But are we really? Is there really any chance at all that the banner of Vanderploeg or Kuiper is actually in the offering? I think in some ways what I saw at Senate is they would love for the Christian Reformed Church to have that kind of power, that kind of influence, for the walls to be around the church and in sort of a larger Benedict option sort of way. Does anybody really imagine this is doable at scale? The CRC today would be difficult for even my grandparents' generation to understand. Now, my grandfather was a minister in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. So he lived through all that. And I remember my grandparents throughout the 80s. And I remember how they talked about what they saw happening. My grandparents were against women in office fiercely. My grandmother, which was really hilarious, my grandmother used to write for the banner. I have a packet of her articles here that when she died, the family accumulated all of her articles of Woman's World. And if you'd read it today, people get this instinct like, oh, that's like Handmaid's Tale. It's nothing like Handmaid's Tale. My grandmother was a very smart, outspoken woman, but the times were different. And I think if she had lived in these times, I don't know. She only had an 8th grade education, and then she went on to get some clerical skills. And those were such different times. So she was working downtown Grand Rapids before she was married, after she got married, because basically they didn't allow Earl Marlink, who was a pastor here in this church, about a contemporary of my father's, a little bit older. He told me about the fact that when he was at seminary, they weren't allowed to be married, and he and his wife Lenore were secretly married, and then the seminary found out about it, and they couldn't tell him to not be any married. They just sort of had to cave. But it's the accumulation of all these kinds of things that was part of this vibe shift that happens in the denomination. Kuyvenhoven felt the shift and adjusted. He did so dramatically with burning the wooden shoes. That cultural regime ruled between 1980 and 2024. That's not a bad run. That's 44 years. Longer than David's rule. Longer than Saul's rule. 44 years. It's a good run. Why is it a shock that it's ended? It's always a shock when it ends. It was just shock in the 60s when that regime, 60s and 70s, when that regime was coming down. And what's amazing is that many of the revolutionaries that, did their thing, stood up to the man, now, of course, they're shocked that their regime is undone, just like their parents before them were shocked that their regime was being undone. A dominant coalition, if not the dominant leadership coalition in the CRC, has been displaced, and the CRC's trajectory has been forked. The banner was the biggest symbol of that for this synod, and perhaps the last element demonstrating this transition. I respect Chong for resigning. He didn't seem able to read the room at synod. After synod did what it did, he could see and adjust. What will the banner become? The truth is that 99% of what has come through the banner over the last decade wouldn't have any difficulty with the revised mandate. This is a tone shift. And now in some of the articles I'm going to point to in a little bit, you can watch this go back and forth. This puts the banner in a very difficult position because it has been reinforcing the 1980 to 2024 tone with its readers. And now if there is a shift, it threatens to alienate the most loyal and faithful readership they have. In other words, when you have a transition like this, you could basically kill the thing because it does have a loyal following. They are of a certain age, and I would imagine that the denomination knows to a pretty good degree where its loyal following is. But part of what happened in this is that there was another loyal following who followed it in some ways because they suspected that they were going to be annoyed by it. So they watched it closely because they were denominational loyalists, and that's sort of the conservative confessional faction of the denomination. The most glaring challenge, however, is the question, and so in order to actually, and this to me is so, you see this in how many different churches in the denomination, churches that are in some ways they were born, they've been led by this generation. Let's call it the original Pepsi generation, because Pepsi keeps trying to say the Pepsi generation, but I'd like to teach the world to sing generation. And again, his name David Hoffman. He has a great channel on YouTube, which he guards jealously. He can't really use his stuff, or he'll basically swat it down using YouTube's mechanics. But he has a lot of really tremendous videos that he's archived from the 60s and 70s. And if you watch those videos, you see that our look back on the 60s and 70s is not like the 60s and 70s were. The 60s and 70s were a vibrant, that there was a lot of conflict. You look back in videos of the 1960s and you look and everybody's wearing these Oxford shirts. They're sort of dressed preppy. They're sort of following Kel Zeldin's fashion advice. And yet, the recent Bob Dylan movie gave you a sense of that. because if you say 1960s, people think it's colored like the gift colored behind me. It's all psychedelics. And no, that's not what it was like. These things happened much more gradually. And it's really in the 70s, in the Vietnam era, and then Watergate, really up until sort of Jimmy Carter and up until Reagan. That's when things, bell bottoms, stripes. I mean, I've got pictures of my youth dressed in this stuff. But my pictures from my early youth, I was a cute little boy wearing sort of little adult clothing, and that was us. We looked like we were from the 50s in the mid to late 60s. It's in the 70s that a lot of these things shifted. The most glaring challenge, in my opinion, is the question of what place does a monthly magazine have in the overall strategy of the Christian Reformed Church. When the banner was put under Ministry Share umbrella and became an every household magazine, it changed. It appeared to be a subtle change, but actually it was a foundational change. Almost all analogous denominational magazines have died. The banner was supposed to replace the promotional mailings that agencies and ministries had been sending out to households. So part of what happens as denominational loyalty and identity breaks down is that people needed to be reminded of all of the agencies and ministries that the Christian Reformed Church had. I heard it at this synod too. Please tell our denomination to use our ministries. So my friend Jerry Dykstra, when he was executive director, I remember when he got that position, he was first out here in California. I went to seminary with him. And then when he first went to the denomination, we want to make CRC things. We want to make the Christian Reformed Church agencies the vendor of choice for our denomination. Because already, this was in the late 90s, early 2000s, you could see the assimilation happening in the denomination, where increasingly Christian Reformed churches are choosing within a marketplace the kinds of things, the kinds of ministries they wanted, the kinds of Sunday school that they wanted, the kinds of VBS materials they wanted, the kind of Bible study materials that they wanted. The Christian Reformed Church was in competition with a marketplace, and all of those marketplace dynamics were different. When the walls were around, back in the H.J. Kuyper years, you only bought Christian Reformed materials. Every now and then, maybe a conservative Presbyterian or something like that. But it had to be Christian Reformed, or it wasn't going to wash. It was our thing. Chong's point to Synod, both through his spoken presentation and the Council of Delegates' right of comment statement in the supplement, mostly crafted by him, was the banner needs to have independence from the institution to be the voice of the people. Now, you're going to hear this in another article that I'm going to point to. This is a classic 1960s countercultural vibe shift posture where the journalist, the youth, the activist stands up to the institution to speak truth to power. Y'all know buzzwords are holy words. You all know the liturgies. What was missing was that over the last 2 decades, many in the denomination, and these were the deepest loyalists in the denomination, these are the people that really up until sort of the advent of Young, Restless, and Reformed. So part of what happens is the CRC in the 80s and 90s, Bill Hybels, son of the denomination, has Willow Creek Church, Home Missions. Home Missions first looked at Schuler, would help subsidize churches to send their leadership to learn from the Crystal Cathedral. And then Bill Hybels, Rick Warren, seeker things. But then the emergent thing happened to the church. And if you want to look at that, you can look at, I did a conversation with John Sook. And he was my landlord in seminary. Again, the CRC, tight-knit group. And when he left the CRC, he sort of rose to the top. He did foreign missions, he did churches, he became banner editor, and then he leaves the denomination and pastors a mainline church in Canada. And his blog is still out there if you want to search for it and read kind of some of the things that he'd been writing. It's sort of a typical emergent church track. But remember, the emergent church sort of split. And so you sort of have the mainline element of the emerging church, and then you have the Young, Restless, and Reformed. And so that begins to pick up speed in the Christian Reformed Church. And pretty soon, John Piper, Tim Keller, John MacArthur, R.C. Sproul, Ligoniers, these are going to become the vendors of choice in an increasing number of conservative confessional Christian Reformed ministers, and the Christian Reformed Church that has some money for church planting and really wants to emphasize diversity in church planting is going to attract people without Dutch names and with darker skin into the Christian Reformed Church, being attracted by the Reformed confessionalism. And I've talked about that in previous videos before. What's missing is that over the last 2 decades, many in the denomination felt that the banner and the network was more akin to Pravda, the mouthpiece of the Communist Party in Russia. The people's voice of the conservatives, and now the young conservatives, were suppressed by the institution. They were blocked, and so women in office sort of gave, even though it's supposed to have 2 voices in the denomination, people pretty quickly figured out that if you weren't okay with women in office, you were not going to get a top denominational position. You were certainly not going to be editor of the Banner. And conservatives figured this out. And they began to say, I guess some are more equal than others. And the Banner became a target of this. And sort of the last thing that happened was Abide tried to buy an ad in the Banner, and Better Together tried to buy an ad in the Banner. The mission of Abide was to keep the Christian Reformed Church traditional on human sexuality, and Better Together came out of Grand Rapids East. They got a more than $1 million Lilly grant. They're run by a number of retired former denominational executives. And their message was sort of, let's not fight over this. They weren't sort of where All One Body or Hesed was, but it was sort of a way to, let's not let this human sexuality thing get out of hand. Certainly not at the gravamen level. And the Banner wouldn't take the money of Abide to run an ad, but they did take the money of Better Together. And for a lot of people, they said, see? And even though the Banner would apologize for that later, it just reinforced the idea that the Banner was the voice of the institution, not the voice of the people. But, of course, again, in this post-war mindset, well, they were the voice of the people, because the conservatives in the Christian Reformed Church were the H.J. Kuiper faction. They were the institution. They were the man. The Christian Reformed Church continued to fight the battles of the 1960s and 70s all the way into the ends of the 19-teens. But then it all shifted. There are dark inverted ironies here, where the revolution is now conservative rather than the progressive. I personally think all these labels are near worthless, but they're lenses that we see through today. The Banner imagined itself to be a kitchen table with Archie, Edith, Gloria, and Meathead. They're living, but today people are living in everything at all at once, and I put clips to those. A lot of people aren't going to know what everything at all at once is. Just this cascade of images flowing at people. And again, this is why a lot of younger people look back at the H.J. Kuiper days and say, that's what we want. That's what we need. The world is a swirl around me. I want something stable. And just listen to the language. Solid, foundation, all of that language. Now that's in some ways deeply modernist, foundationalist language. Is it modernist? Is it pre-postmodern? Or is it meta-modern? It's really hard to tell. Now the really difficult work begins. Well, let's hold this off until. So, in the title of the piece in 1991, Burning Shoes and Banana Peels. At Synod, now I'm going to put the deliberations for the banner. I'm just going to clip it and put it at the end of this video. So if you want to watch it, you can find it easy. It's going to be uncut. I'm just gonna let it run, and you can watch it and make up your own mind. But I said to Synod, that was before I found this article. I just found this article right before I started making this video. I said to Synod, I said the two most important issues of the banner in our lifetime are the burning of the wooden shoes edition, and the second one isn't even an issue of the banner. It's the banana. One of the things that came up was, do you know, if you ask AI questions about this, do you know where AI gets its information? The banner. When I asked about some of these things, AI spit out some information. I went to the articles. There's a little sources button, sources. Went to the article. Oh, I see exactly what AI did. Here it is. So burning shoes and banana peels. James Scott, one of the most important CRC writers over the last few decades, taught English at Dort, wrote a piece in 2016. 2015 was another flare-up, and that's where you had the mandate. We'll talk a little bit about that now, or in a little bit. Earlier this year, the front page of the Canadian biweekly Christian Courier featured a headline that to me was perfectly stunning: 100 ordained women in CRC ministry today. And he writes about the fact that he remembered that it was just the 1990s, 1980s and 1990s that the CRC had that fight. It seems like yesterday I sat in a packed Synod galleries, intensely attuned to discussions as rigidly polarized, or even more so, as United States politics during the Obama era. I was a banner reporter back then, not a synodical delegate. Editor Andy Kuyvenhoven had asked me to help his staff cover Synod. So although I was decidedly liberal, I was largely unaffiliated with either side. That's because he was at Dort instead of at the center, Grand Rapids. Talks about words matter. I bring all this up. So headline, 100 ordained women in CRC ministry today. I bring all this up because I wonder whether in my lifetime at least those years may have been among the best years of the official magazine of the Christian Reformed Church. Words mattered because issues mattered. Thousands left the denomination for more progressive churches. Even more left for more conservative fellowships. But everyone read the banner. Not everyone loved it, but everyone read it. Who my age will forget a pair of wooden shoes blazing across the cover, set there by an immigrant preacher-editor who may well have been more Dutch than most of his readers. People cared deeply about issues, probably too deeply. Words counted. The banner put them out there, and people read the banner. An even higher percentage of denominational readership read the banner from 1928 well into the 1950s when H.J. Kuyper, a preacher who came as close to anyone to being a CRC pope, was an editor. I was a kid in the 50s, too young to care about any magazine or editor, but my parents read the banner eagerly and loved editor Kuyper, who, said James Bratt in Dutch Calvinism in the Modern America, was the authority on all issues of truth and morals, a voice whose every word was to be eagerly awaited, treasured, and most of all, heeded. It was a wholly different banner, a wholly different CRC, and a wholly different age. Back then in the spring when the magazine published pictures of seminary grads, lots and lots of grandmas cut out those pictures and pasted them in the scrapbooks. And plenty of moms were hoping that maybe, well, actually it was more the Christian school teachers when they'd go out into the circulatory system. People followed our Indian cousins in New Mexico, and 18-year-old kids bound for college rarely considered going anywhere but Calvin in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Dutch bingo wasn't all that popular because everyone already knew everyone else. My parents in Wisconsin could not have imagined Sunday morning without listening to Reverend Peter Eldersveld preach from the preaching on WHBL Sheboygan. They loved his passion and his thoughtfulness, in part because he was ours, You heard Rod in some of those synod recordings say owns. Ours is a strange word. Ours is a strange word no one uses today. Reverend B.J. Hahn, the founder of Dordt College, frequently talked about our people from the pulpit. And from behind the radio microphone, our people have to talk about this or that, he'd say, as if we were a tribe or a bowling team. Even if you weren't one of us back then, you knew very well who he was talking about. All of that has changed. The Banner has become an entirely different magazine to serve a vastly different readership in a whole new world. Not long ago, my wife and I visited a Christian Reformed church where the screens up front ran announcements, including a line announcing the topic for that day's adult Sunday school. Why we should no longer read the Banner. I thought Rod Serling might step in suddenly to tell me I'd entered the twilight zone. The big alterations the Banner has gone through in my lifetime have resulted, at least in part, from far more comprehensive changes that the varying politics and theological reflections of its editors and staff. The Banner is new, and it must continue to be new in our ever-changing world. Now, this was after the 2015 mandate change, which then was again changed in this synod. I grew up at the very end of an era when a nap was the path of righteousness come Sunday afternoon. A nap and a banner. My father's father, a pastor, was immersed in denominational culture. When my dad came home from World War II, he longed for the stability and peace he believed he could find in that same tradition. You see a thread right there? Those people from World War II, what did they want? And you see it all over the culture. We want houses. We want stability. Today, when we talk about trauma, they didn't talk about trauma then, but you've got to imagine those Dutch immigrants coming from the Netherlands, having survived the occupation and then the hunger after the occupation and the end of the war, filled with trauma. Those soldiers coming back filled with trauma. What did they want? Stability, predictability. They wanted conformity. Now, conformity, read George Marsden's The Twilight of the American Enlightenment, about how those things played out. The Banner continued to hold as deified a place as it had maintained with his father before him. Required reading on Sunday. That's the way my parents chose to live. But I remember sitting down between a driveway basketball court and home on a Sunday afternoon, sitting there so my shirt could dry, where it was wet from a pickup game far enough away from our place not to be seen or heard. You didn't play basketball on Sunday. You didn't swim on Sunday. If you read the Banner, you'll see them start to pick at the Sabbatarianism. I simply didn't dare go home full of sweaty sin. When in the mid-60s, strict Sabbath observance began to loosen, the Banner lost its place, and probably many readers, not because editorials had changed, either too liberal or too conservative, but because we had changed. In Wisconsin, where I grew up, Vince Lombardi and the championship Green Bay Packers playing on TV every Sunday may have done as much to diminish Banner readership than any series of articles inside the magazine. The world of H.J. Kuiper was history. The walls were down. The proto-Benedict option that the Christian Reformed Church lived in was receding. Since 2005, there's been a new plan. Every CRC family receives the Banner free of charge, either at church or in their mailbox at home. It's a monthly, not a weekly. And just this morning, I watched a video of Dr. Steve Timmermans, executive director of the CRC, explaining a brand new program that will put most of the CRC library of materials in the hands of churches and individuals. If you're not going to look at it, if you're not going to be able to pay for it from the denomination, maybe we can give it to you. Maybe then you'll use it. Books of mine will likely be included. At least I hope so. Books, videos, and most other resources will be free to CRC members so we can use them on any computer or tablet or smartphone. CRC Digital Library is yet another emblem of immense change. Lots of folks call the era in which we live the information age because the massive information we access night or day at our desks, in our laps, in our hands is endless. Today, time weighs a quarter of what it did 2 decades ago. Newsweek is gone. General interest magazines still exist, but they're strapped for subscribers. What happened to the Banner happened also to countless other periodicals. And he goes on for more stories. Then he talks about the Banner, because again, it was key. In the spring of 1970, I was a senior in college and an assistant editor of the Dordt College Diamond when some Calvin College delinquents published a spoof they called the Banana that included fulsome shots at Dordt, Warp College, midfields of golden corn. I loved it, Scop says. Envy devoured my system like gangrene. I'd never seen anything so masterful. A pitch-perfect parody, cover-to-cover hilarious. But oh my goodness, how naughty. I put the link below. Read it. See how it strikes you. Compare it to what you see on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or YouTube or wherever you're grazing the internet at this point. People were aghast. One of the articles featured a pregnant girl in Oatesburg, Wisconsin. The people who called Oostburg home were livid. I know, they told me. The nation was at war then in Vietnam, but also at home. Just a week later, after the shootings at Kent State, I'd be marching in Washington. That violent generational shift meant there were probably only 2 ways to read the Banner. First, with a belly laugh that came to me only after my jealousy flatlined. Second, with righteous horror, my parents' way. To them, the Banner may not have been outright blasphemy, but Lord Almighty, it was definitely sacrilege. How to view the second coming? Can you imagine? The Banner succeeded in doing what it attempted only because the Banner itself was so greatly loved. Everyone knew the Banner, and everybody got the joke. Many didn't laugh, some cried. Today a response to the same effort would be ho-hum. In late April 1970, the late 60s crashed headlong into my parents' blessed denominational culture. Things would never be the same. Neither would Oostburg CRC, I suppose. Neither would the Banner. And there's an attachment of a copy of the Banner right there on that page as well. Think about that. Would you imagine years later the Banner would just, here's the Banner. You can have it. Just take it. Again, the change is just breathtaking. So the latest article to come out was that Chong resigned in protest. Xiao Chong, editor-in-chief of The Banner, the magazine of the Christian Reformed Church, tendered his resignation with the publication June 23. His last day as editor will be July 11. Shirley DeVries, chief administrative officer of the CRC, was working with the Office of General Secretary, Banner staff, and the Banner Advisory Committee to make sure that staff is well supported and the publishing schedule is maintained. Chong said, I am resigning partly in protest of Synod's decision to change the Banner's mandate by disavowing diverse views. It curtailed editorial freedom, and I believe it is not good for the denomination's long-term spiritual health. I am also resigning because I discern that with this mandate change, God has released me from my call. Probably the more interesting article is from Sarah Sund. And she goes into quite a bit more deeply, and she goes into exactly the change that nobody set this up. I knew when I got this assignment, first it's the finance team, and basically because of what happened in 2024, the finance team doesn't really make any changes in finance. It just passes things along as information. And then on top of the cake, they threw this. And I thought, I had no idea which way it was going to go. I had zero idea which way it was going to go. But Synod was amazingly united. I really didn't think our committee would. So what happened was two overtures came to Synod. One overture was from a church in Classis Greater Los Angeles, which wasn't picked up by its classis, and its overture basically said, scrap the banner mandate and start over. That was seen as more of a radical one. From Classis Heartland, there was an overture that is a lot like what finally came out of the advisory committee. And the advisory committee wanted to tweak it, but basically the advisory committee looked at that overture and said, yeah, that's how Synod works. Now, the complaint made here, again, you'll hear defensive, well, maybe I'll read some of it. For decades, the Banner has been the official magazine of the Christian Reformed Church. Since 2015, the Banner has worked under a mandate and publishing guidelines that called for editorial staff to show the diverse positions held within the denomination and permitted staff to lead and encourage a responsible discussion of the issues important to the life of the church through editorial comment and publications of articles that represent the various views held within the church and permit people of the church to voice their views and reactions, even though some of those views may be unacceptable to others in the church. With these guidelines, while no organization is perfect at living out its goal, we acted sincerely and with enormous effort of thought. In doing so, we have upheld an almost 160-year tradition and published an award-winning magazine. Now, every time I hear the argument from tradition, I think the Banner has changed repeatedly. And the Banner has changed because the church has changed and the world has changed. And so to argue that the mandate from 2015 was from all the way back into the period of the Dutch in the church, I don't buy it. Read H.J. Kuyper. Read the publications that the Banner itself. Read how the Banner itself has described its history. I just read a piece from 1991 and a piece from 2016. Lament. When it comes down to it, journalism is about telling the truth. The truth is, I lament Synod's removal of those parts of our guiding document. I lament especially the way Synod did it. When Synod 2014 considered changing the Banner's mandate, it appointed a study committee to look at it for a year and report back. With that year of study and consideration, it came back with a report and decision. I lamented the Synod 2025. I lament that Synod 2025 did not do this. Why didn't Synod 2025 do this? That's simple. Synod 2025, to one degree or another, still doesn't trust the institution. What Herb Brinks wrote about in 1991, talking about concerns about institution, well, it's the conservatives now that were concerned about the institution. And what you've seen in synods from 2022 to now is synodical delegates are saying, we want synod to make decisions. We're not going to throw everything to the COD. We're not going to throw everything to the Office of General Secretary. We're going to make decisions. And it's synod's right to make decisions. Now, should synod be deciding everything? They still throw plenty to other people. But in this case, that advisory committee made decisions, sent it to the synod floor, and given how it went in the advisory committee, I wasn't surprised it passed. So what she walks through below is, in fact, the change. And usually the way Synod works with the website is that the advisory committee reports come out and then they sort of disappear. And so it's good that she posted all this here, so there's a good historical record of what that advisory committee did. And that's what they did. And Synod said yes. And Synod said yes pretty overwhelmingly. And again, I wasn't surprised. Now to end my piece. The banner imagined itself to be a kitchen table with Archie, Edith, Gloria, and Meathead. That was the kitchen table that the banner imagined itself to be. Archie, the World War II vet, the conservative, the racist, the one against women, Archie Bunker, Edith, nice, subject to Gloria's influence, wanting something, Meathead and Gloria, the children of the future. That was the kitchen table that the banner was designed for. As I said in my Synod speech, again, I'll put it at the end here, our children are living in a cafeteria. And many of their parents that are Meathead and Gloria, when they sit down there with their kids, they say, I just want you to be happy. And some of our kids, not all, are saying, why don't you tell me what you really believe? And that's what's happening. Now the really difficult work begins. Finishing off an already toppled regime is one thing. Figuring out what to do next is an entirely different level. Kuyvenhoven got to follow the script, already well worn by a broader, unified culture. Keep 20 steps behind the main line. Add some neo-Calvinism. You'll be okay. There's no script for the CRC to follow, really. People will look at the PCA or some other post-progressive ideas. There is no H.J. Kuyper right now, which is probably a good thing. As many here have noted, Kuyper and Vanderploeg were gone before many in CRC pulpits were born. The Kuyvenhoven class banner editors, Canadian, moderate progressives, had a pretty amazing run. It's hard, however, to remember John Sook's journey. I came into Synod not asking, should Chong be editor? Should we adjust the banner mandate? I fully expected we would give this to the COT. Because that's what Synod does. It's not what happened. But rather, what really are we doing with this thing? Part of the problem with what passes today for CRC conservatism is that we don't have too much of a template beyond we should undo the post-war consensus. And again, another James Scott piece at the 150th anniversary of the denomination that I've mentioned often is that we basically follow other lights outside of the denomination. It was always true that the denomination was impacted by much broader things going on in the culture. But now, most of our leaders are not in the denomination. Fill the banner with exactly what? Sermons, devotional, movie reviews, more Rod Hugan, of course. I love Rod. I love what Rod writes. I love what Rod does. And Rod, again, as if you look at my conversation with Rod and Aaliyah, it's a great picture because Rod is deeply CRC. He loves the CRC, but because he's so kind of out on a CRC outpost or fringe, just watch that video with Rod and Aaliyah that I posted about the post-war consensus. But the question is serious. Imagine the CRC deciding to buy a retired commercial airliner so that it wouldn't have to pay United or Air Canada to shuttle people to our meetings. We would howl at the silliness of it. Is it the case that a denominational monthly magazine is something like that? Part of the reality of the Christian Reformed Church is that for our attention via social media, via older forms of media, the denomination no longer has our attention like it had it when the Banner was the only magazine that many households got. The denomination held the attention, the Banner held the attention of the denomination. That is gone. That is just gone, and it's not coming back. And so the leaders of the denomination are often not even in the denomination. I've got more ideas about this, but I'm not going to put them all in here. They'll come out, I'm sure, at some point. We are awash in communication. If you want to listen to CRC Voices, there's no end of places. And most people will jump into CRC Voices, and then it'll be like, maybe AI will, maybe they'll use the little AI button now on top of your email reader and say, summarize this post. Because the volume, that's the point. The point isn't that we're lacking good information. I'm sure there's good information out there, but can you find it? How do you find it? And the really key question, which is the word that you'll hear again and again and again and again during these synods, trust. Who do we trust? And what you heard from Synod was, we're going to remake things because we've got trust issues. And so that's what we're doing. If you want to listen to CRC Voices, there's no end of places. To Facebook, to Twitter, to the Reformed Journal, to the Abide website, to Substacks, etc., etc. Today I wanted some news about the Democratic mayoral primary. Do I go to the New York Times? Is the New York Times a New York newspaper? Or is the New York Times a national newspaper? I've been reading the New York Times since I was in junior high. The New York Times today is a very different thing because everything around it is different. Is it still a city paper? Sort of, but not really. What are newspapers today? What are magazines? But again, this isn't all just one way. Why do young people love vinyl? I remember when vinyl was all we had. When CDs came along, it was like, this is an improvement. When you could rip CDs and have a little music player, this is an improvement. To have endless music on my smartphone seems great to me. But it's the liturgy of that vinyl record going on to the record player. It's going to have to be a really good record and a really good record player if it's going to sound better than a CD, because I'll tell you, I played a lot of scratchy records on a lot of crappy record players, and it was just crap. And this is where the Christian Reformed Church is not going back to H.J. Kuyper. That will not happen. I suspect we will find a new editor and the banner will continue. But when everything around changes, when everything around something changes, that thing changes too. I'm not sure much, though, has gone into how our internet, everything all at once world changes what a denomination is. Because that's actually my bigger question than the banner. Because the banner was a function, and James Scott writes about this beautifully. He's one of the best authors to read on this. It was a whole. And TV was out there. But Scott was right. You can just imagine him drying his shirt because he did a pickup game, but he can't walk into the house with a wet shirt, or his parents will look at him and know, what have you done on the Sabbath, son? What a denomination is, or what it decides to commit to paper or to pixels under a domain name. All right, so you can quit now if you want to, or I'm just going to cut and I'm just going to segment in the Synod proceedings, and you might find them boring. They might put you to sleep, but this was what we're talking about, and yeah, leave a comment.